The linen napkin was still in my lap when my son leaned over and whispered, "You embarrass me." Still, I folded it slowly, like I was tucking the last piece of myself away for good. As the hum of silverware filled the room, I noticed the way his wife beamed at her mother across the table. While they shared a look, I traced the rim of my glass and remembered who paid for every chair in this room. The same son who shamed me didn't ask who handled the trust this time. That's when I slid the seat beside the lawyer to the woman he prefers, and let it cost him everything. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The Stonegate Gala was a beautiful affair, held under a sky smeared with the dusky glow of early evening. Strings of lights twinkled like a constellation above the crowd, and the scent of fresh flowers mingled with the low murmur of polite conversation. Margaret Vincent, perched at a small round table near the edge of the ballroom, laughed, a bright, genuine laugh, as a man at the table, an old friend of her late husband's, cracked a joke about his younger days as a hopeless romantic. She hadn't meant to laugh so loudly, but it felt good, real. The years of careful composure, the years of quiet grief, all seemed to pull away in that moment, like a curtain drawing back to reveal something raw, but freeing. Margaret felt young again, or perhaps just alive. Brian, sitting next to her, stiffened as her laugh rippled across the room. His hand, which had been holding a wineglass, froze midair. The smile on his face was tight, a forced attempt at diplomacy, but it faltered as his eyes darted around the table. "Mom, please." His voice dropped low, but the words cut through the hum of the conversation like a blade. "You're starting to embarrass me." The room seemed to shrink in that moment. The music blurred into the background, the glasses clinked a little too sharply, and the people around them became distant figures, as if Margaret had suddenly been thrust into a place where she no longer belonged. Her wineglass, suspended in her hand, wavered for a brief second, the rich red liquid swirling with the slight tremor of her fingers. She froze, utterly still, as if time itself had paused, and the world was waiting for her to respond. Brian leaned back, eyes flickering with that familiar, condescending mixture of irritation and forced politeness that had become too common between them in recent years. Elena, ever the careful observer, didn't even glance at her. Instead, she pretended to examine the table setting, her hands delicately folding the napkin into perfect corners. Margaret could feel Elena's avoidance like a weight on her shoulders, pressing her into silence. Helen, sitting beside Margaret, shifted uncomfortably. Her hands, which had been clasped neatly in her lap, were now nervously adjusting the cuff of her sleeve. There was no kindness in her expression, no attempt to soften the tension. It was as if the very air had thickened with an unspoken understanding that this moment, this small rupture in civility, could not be ignored. Margaret blinked, the reality of the words settling heavily around her. She had known it was coming, had felt it in the changing patterns of their interactions, the small but constant erosion of her place in Brian's life. But hearing it spoken aloud, spoken so publicly, was a blow that rattled her bones. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice cool and controlled, though something inside her twisted painfully. Without waiting for a reply, she stood, straightened her dress, and quietly made her way to the edge of the room, then toward the door. Her footsteps were purposeful, yet they felt unnaturally loud on the marble floors. Behind her, she could hear the faint murmurs of conversation, hectic whispers that she couldn't quite make out. But it didn't matter. She didn't need to hear them. She had already heard enough. The crisp air outside was a sharp contrast to the warmth of the ballroom, the coolness biting at her skin as she stepped into the parking lot. She hadn't expected to feel anything like this deep, curling sense of being adrift. But there it was, all around her, in every breath she took. And then she heard it. Grandma, are you okay? Allison's voice cut through the fog of her thoughts, soft but concerned, as the young girl approached her from behind. Margaret turned to see Allison standing a few feet away, her face a mixture of confusion and quiet empathy. Margaret's mouth twitched, but the words didn't come. She didn't want to talk about it. Not yet. Not with her. Not now. Instead, Margaret simply shook her head, the weight of her own emotions pressing down on her chest. "He's not," she murmured, her voice low, tinged with the kind of weariness that seemed to accumulate over the years, layer by layer, until it felt too heavy to carry. Allison didn't say anything more, just stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm, offering what little comfort she could. But Margaret didn't need words. She already knew. She'd always known. The house of cards she'd carefully built was starting to crumble. One cruel comment, one fractured moment at a time. And no matter how much she wished it weren't true, she couldn't stop the inevitable shift that had begun. Her son had made his choice. Now it was time for hers. The heavy oak door to Hawthorne and Blake LLP swung open with a soft creak as Margaret stepped inside, the familiar scent of aged wood and polished leather filling the air. It was the kind of place where decisions were made in whispered tones, the kind of place that had seen many Vinces come and go, but only one Margaret Vincent and only one kind of trust. Elliot Blake, the family's longtime estate attorney, sat behind his grand desk, his fingers tapping absently on the polished surface as he reviewed some papers. His sharp eyes flicked up as she entered, his expression unreadable yet welcoming, as always. "Margaret," he said with a soft smile, standing to greet her. "It's been a while. What can I do for you today?" Margaret didn't return the smile. Instead, she moved swiftly to the chair across from his desk, lowering herself into it with the kind of precision that only comes from a lifetime of practicing composure. The weight of her decision was heavy, yet there was no trace of hesitation in her body. She knew what needed to be done, and this was the first step. "I want to revise the trust," she said, her voice steady but resolute. Quietly. Elliot's brows lifted slightly, but he nodded, his face morphing into a thoughtful yet cautious expression. "I assume you have some changes in mind?" Margaret's eyes flicked toward the window, watching the soft glow of the city outside, but her mind was elsewhere, focused solely on the task at hand. She had been preparing for this for years, but hearing the words aloud, the change, the rupture, was still a jarring realization. She looked back at Elliot, her gaze direct. "Brian is no longer the successor trustee." The words hung in the air, stark and firm, as if they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. Elliot didn't react immediately, but Margaret could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tightening of the space between them as the implications began to settle in. "Understood," Elliot said, his voice measured. "And the primary heir?" Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's out of that role too." A long silence followed. The only sound was the soft rustling of papers as Elliot took in the full weight of her request. The trust had been built by her and her late husband, but Margaret had always been the one holding the strings. Brian had never really seen the full extent of her influence. Until now. Elliot cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Who will replace him then?" "Not family," Margaret replied with quiet decisiveness. "Someone who sees me. Someone who understands what I've built, not just what I've given." Elliot paused, clearly processing the layers of Margaret's words. This was more than just a revision. It was a fundamental reordering of the entire structure, a refusal to continue the patterns that had long been set in motion. "And Brian?" Elliot asked, his voice soft with the weight of 1,000 years of history and family loyalty. "How should we handle asset disclosures?" Margaret's lips tightened. "Freeze them. Until further notice. He doesn't need to know anything right now. Elliot's eyes flicked to the side, and for the briefest of moments, she saw the flicker of hesitation. He was a man who had always been careful with his words, with his loyalty, but this was different. He knew the gravity of what Margaret was doing, the fallout it would cause. "This will sting," Elliot said quietly, almost to himself. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A statement that rang with the knowledge of years spent observing the damage that often followed such deep shifts. Margaret's face remained impassive, though her eyes hardened just slightly, the faintest glint of determination flickering within them. "Only when the masks come off," she replied, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the cool surface of the desk, fingers curling slightly. "This will sting, but only for those who have been hiding behind them." The weight of her words settled between them, and for a moment there was nothing more to say. Elliot nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful as he flipped through the legal files in front of him, making the necessary notes. He was no stranger to such matters, but this was personal. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind already shifting to the next steps. There was no turning back now. The delicate web of relationships, years of careful orchestration, was about to come undone. Brian would never see it coming, and neither would Elena. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to breathe deeply. She was no longer playing the part of the dutiful mother, the quiet matriarch. She was the one pulling the strings now. As Elliot jotted down the final details, Margaret stood, her posture as rigid as ever but with the faintest sense of satisfaction curling in her chest. "You'll take care of everything, won't you?" she asked, her voice suddenly soft, almost a command. "Of course," Elliot replied, his voice steady. "This is what I'm here for." Margaret nodded, then turned to leave. As she passed through the door and stepped into the hallway, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the sharp edge of anticipation. Her son would be the last to know, and when he found out, it would already be too late. The soft clink of silverware and the quiet murmur of conversation filled the air as Margaret sat across from Helen at a polished marble table in the sun-dappled dining room of Helen's home. The linen napkins were perfectly folded, the chilled rosé sparkling in crystal glasses, but the room, despite its beauty, was heavy with unspoken words. It was supposed to be a casual lunch, an afternoon to reaffirm the civility they had shared for years, nothing more, nothing less. Yet, Margaret could feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface, like the heat of a storm about to break. She could sense it in the way Helen's eyes didn't quite meet hers, in the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her napkin. Helen was trying too hard to play the part of the gracious hostess, but there was a jaggedness in the air that neither of them could ignore. "So," Helen began, her voice attempting to sound light but coming off as strained, "Brian didn't mean it, you know. He's under a lot of pressure with the business, and the quarterly reports are due." Margaret raised her hand just slightly, silencing her. Her eyes, cool and composed, never left Helen's. "Respect doesn't get suspended during quarterly reviews." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Helen flinched, her smile faltering just for a fraction of a second. She knew Margaret well enough to understand that this wasn't just a statement, it was a line drawn, one that could not be crossed again without consequence. Helen's eyes darted toward the large window, where the sun's rays pierced through the leaves of the tree outside, casting long shadows on the table. She took a breath before responding, the words coming out slower, more carefully. "Perhaps we've overstayed your boundaries, Margaret." The phrase lingered in the space between them, a suggestion of something more, something that was now crawling out from beneath the polite veneer of their relationship. Margaret could feel it, the subtle shift, the faint fracture that had always been there, but was now widening. She was no longer a peripheral player in this family, a secondary voice that could be ignored. Or perhaps I've just been too quiet at mine, Margaret replied, her voice calm but resolute, like a blade gliding through silk. There was no anger in her words, no outburst, but Helen felt the weight of them all the same. Margaret's calmness was more potent than any loud confrontation could ever be. It was the quiet before the storm, the sudden realization that the world around them was shifting beneath their feet. Helen cleared her throat and reached for her glass of rosé, swirling the pale liquid as if she could find some answer within it. "I've always respected you, Margaret," she said quietly, her eyes meeting Margaret's for the first time in several moments. "I've always supported Brian. You know that." Margaret's gaze softened only slightly, but her voice remained unwavering. "And I've always appreciated your support, Helen." She raised her glass to meet Helen's. "But there's a difference between support and manipulation. And there's a difference between respect and expectation." Helen's lips tightened into a thin line, but she raised her glass as well, the two women clinking them gently in a hollow toast. It was a moment of politeness, a moment of formality. Nothing more. No warmth, no sincerity, just civility. They took a sip, the cool liquid doing little to ease the tension that had built between them. For a moment, the clink of the glasses was the loudest sound in the room. Helen placed her glass down with a soft sigh. "I never wanted this to come between us, Margaret. You know that." Margaret set her glass down too, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Then don't let it." Her voice was softer now, almost intimate, as if she were confiding a deep, personal truth. "Because I'm not the one standing in your way." Helen looked taken aback, as if the words had struck her with an unexpected force. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as if unsure of how to continue. The mask of diplomacy, the carefully constructed persona, was slipping, revealing something more vulnerable beneath it. Margaret watched the struggle pass through Helen's face, the fleeting moment of doubt before she recovered her composure. "I never wanted this to be difficult," Helen said quietly, almost apologetically. "But you know Brian. He's not the same person he used to be. I'm just trying to keep the peace." Margaret's lips twitched. She leaned back slightly in her chair, the faintest smile touching her eyes. "It's not about keeping the peace, Helen. It's about knowing what the peace costs." Helen's eyes flickered with something, perhaps guilt, perhaps realization, but before she could respond, the distant sound of a car door slamming outside broke the moment. It was an abrupt sound, cutting through the tension like a knife. Margaret stood slowly, her movements smooth and deliberate. "I appreciate the lunch, Helen, but I think I've overstayed my own boundaries." Helen stood too, the weight of the conversation settling between them, though the distance between them felt even greater now. Margaret's voice was steady, but there was a finality in it that made Helen pause. "We both know where this is headed, and I'm not waiting for it to happen any longer." Helen opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, Margaret walked toward the door, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. As she stepped out of the house, the cool air greeted her, and she didn't look back. The conversation had shifted. The pieces were moving, and Margaret knew that the next move would be hers to make. The china plates were almost cleared when Helen asked the question. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even direct. It came laced in courtesy, wrapped in that soft, deliberate tone she always used when she wanted something without appearing to want it. "So, Margaret," she began, her fork resting neatly beside the half-eaten salad. "Who's handling things for you these days? The trust? The house? All of that?" It was phrased like concern, like an innocent question from one woman to another, but Margaret heard what lay underneath. "Who holds the power now? Who did you choose? If not my son?" She didn't answer. Instead, Margaret reached for her linen napkin, dabbing at the corner of her lips with practiced grace. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't waver. She simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that stopped just shy of warmth. The silence stretched long enough for Helen to notice it, long enough for the space between them to cool by a few degrees. Helen's expression shifted. Barely. A flicker of confusion, then understanding, then something sharper. Her lips tightened, but her posture didn't falter. She was too well trained for that. Margaret finally set her napkin down beside her plate. Her voice, when she spoke, was composed silk, smooth, elegant, impossible to grab hold of. It's all in good hands. Helen's gaze lingered on her, searching for meaning, for some confirmation that Margaret hadn't just said what she thought she had. But Margaret gave her nothing else. No hint, no elaboration, no crack in the facade. For the rest of lunch, they spoke of meaningless things: floral arrangements for the charity gala, a neighbor's new car, the restoration of the club's ballroom chandelier. The kind of subjects that people with perfect lives use to keep their imperfections from spilling out. When they said goodbye at the door, Helen's hug was brief, her perfume sharp and heavy in the air. Margaret watched her drive away, the taillights fading down the tree-lined street. Only then did she exhale, her breath fogging faintly in the cool autumn light. The game had changed, and Helen knew it. Back at the Vincent house, the air was still. Afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains in long golden streaks. Margaret moved through her study with quiet precision. The place felt both sanctuary and war room now. On her desk sat a thick binder labeled in clean black script, Vincent Family Trust. The edges were neatly tabbed, each section marked by decades of careful planning. Margaret opened it to a fresh page, took a fountain pen from its holder, and wrote slowly, deliberately, Helen Carpenter. Contingency contact. Yes. The sound of ink scratching across paper was steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a plan coming alive. She closed the folder, locked it, and sat back in her chair. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass of a framed photo nearby. Brian, Elena, and Allison at a 4th of July picnic years ago. Margaret had been behind the camera, smiling, believing the picture would hold something real. She studied their faces for a long moment, then turned it face down. "Done making assumptions, are we?" came a voice from the doorway. Margaret didn't turn. She didn't need to. Dottie, her longtime housekeeper and confidant, leaned against the frame, drying her hands on a towel. Her presence was familiar, grounding, one of the few constants left. Dottie nodded toward the locked file. "You're playing chess, Maggie. Most mothers just cry." Margaret allowed herself a soft laugh, a short, controlled exhale. "I did that last year." Dottie's eyes softened, but there was something wary in them too. "He's still your boy." "Was," Margaret corrected, her tone mild, but the word landed like a gavel. "He stopped being my boy the day he started managing me like an asset." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking time with an indifferent precision. Finally, Dottie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Whatever you're setting in motion, make sure it doesn't take you down with it." Margaret looked up, her expression serene but resolute. "Dottie, if it takes me down, it means I was standing tall enough to fall." Dottie studied her a moment longer, then gave a small, knowing nod. "You always did like your endings neat." Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last of the daylight was beginning to fade. "Not neat," she said quietly. "Just deserved." As Dottie left the room, Margaret turned back to her desk. The silver key to the file glinted in her hand for a moment before she tucked it away in a small drawer. Outside, a wind picked up, rustling the leaves that lined the driveway, each one caught in a quiet, deliberate fall. Margaret leaned back, eyes narrowing on the shadows stretching across the room. The silence wrapped around her, heavy but comforting. It didn't need to be loud to make its point. By morning, Helen would know. And Brian, well, Brian would start to feel the ground shift beneath him. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the study, casting long, angled shadows on the polished wood floors. Margaret sat behind the large mahogany desk, her fingers idly tapping on the leather-bound ledger in front of her. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, an uneasy calm before a storm that she had carefully orchestrated. Elliot Blake arrived first, his tailored suit crisp and impeccable as always. He moved with his usual grace, but his eyes held the weight of anticipation. The tension between them was no longer subtle. It had become an unspoken understanding that today, the game would change irrevocably. "Margaret," he greeted her, his voice a low murmur of familiarity. "You wanted to meet early?" Margaret nodded, not bothering to rise from her chair. "We'll begin when Helen arrives. I want things to be clear." Elliot studied her for a moment, his sharp mind calculating, assessing. He could see it now, the shift in her demeanor. The same woman who once stood silently by, letting her son's ambitions dictate the family's future, had found her voice. And she was using it as a weapon. The door opened again and Helen entered, her face a study in restrained grace. She offered no warm greeting, no smile, just the bare minimum of politeness as she took her seat across from Margaret. The three of them were alone now. No distractions, no side conversations. Just the quiet hum of the clock, ticking away the seconds that would forever alter the course of their lives. Margaret broke the silence first. "Helen, I appreciate you coming. There are a few things that need to be made official." Her voice was steady, measured, but beneath the calmness was a steel that made the air feel thinner, colder. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been waiting for this moment for months, but now that it was here, doubt crept into her mind. She glanced toward Elliot, who gave her a subtle nod of reassurance. "Are you sure about this?" Helen asked, her voice just above a whisper. Her eyes flicked to Margaret's, seeking something, anything, that would suggest this wasn't happening. Margaret's gaze never wavered. "You don't interrupt or dismiss me, Helen. Not anymore." She paused, letting the words settle in the space between them. "The time for second-guessing is over." Helen took a slow breath, her fingers curling slightly on the edge of the chair, but she said nothing. She had seen Margaret's determination before, but this was different. This wasn't just a woman asserting her rights. This was a woman reclaiming everything she had been denied for years. Margaret turned to Elliot. "Draw it up." Elliot nodded without question. He had always been loyal to Margaret, had always respected her subtle control over the family's affairs. But even he couldn't hide the faintest trace of surprise as he took the folder from his briefcase and began outlining the revisions. The first of the changes came quickly. "Helen," Margaret said, her tone firm but not unkind, "you will now be co-advisor of my foundation. You will also be my medical proxy." Helen blinked, her mind struggling to catch up. She had expected this, perhaps, but the finality of it still struck like a blow to the gut. To be positioned so deliberately, so carefully in Margaret's plans, it was both an honor and a subtle mark of her own inadequacy in Brian's eyes. Margaret didn't look at her for approval. She didn't need it. Instead, her eyes were focused on the legal documents in front of them. The ink was already drying on the changes, and it was too late to retract them. "As of today," Margaret continued, "Brian is blocked from accessing any of the key accounts. He will not be able to make withdrawals, request documents, or move any assets without your approval." The words were simple, but the weight of them was immense. Helen's mind raced. Brian had always believed himself to be the one in control, the one who would inherit it all, the one who would shape the family's future. But Margaret had just turned that narrative on its head. Elliot leaned back in his chair, watching Margaret closely. "You've flipped the hierarchy, Margaret." There was a quiet awe in his voice. He had known her for years, but this was something new. This was power in its purest, most unyielding form. Margaret allowed herself a small smile, but it was not one of satisfaction. It was a smile that spoke of acceptance, of knowing exactly what had to be done. "No, I just brought honesty to it." The room was silent for a moment. The only sound was the quiet rustle of paper as Elliot made the final adjustments. Helen shifted uncomfortably, her mind struggling to grasp the full scope of what had just transpired. She had been loyal to Margaret, always, in her own way. But this was a different kind of loyalty. It wasn't about family. It wasn't about Brian. This was about power, and Margaret was wielding it with cold precision. "Brian won't like this," Helen said quietly, her voice finally breaking the silence. "No," Margaret agreed, her gaze unwavering. "But he'll understand. Eventually." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers curling around the edge of the table as she stared at the documents before her. "The family will never be the same, but I will be." Elliot gave her a final knowing glance before signing the papers in front of him. The weight of the moment pressed in on all of them, but it was a weight they could not escape. Helen sat there, frozen in the realization that everything was changing. And yet, despite the confusion and uncertainty swirling inside her, she knew one thing for certain. Margaret had already won. Margaret looked up, her gaze piercing. "Now," she said quietly, "we get to work." The ground beneath them had shifted. And no one, not Brian, not Elena, and certainly not Helen, could ever unmake the changes Margaret had set in motion. The envelope was heavy in Allison's hands, the weight of it not just in paper, but in anticipation. She held it carefully, turning it over, inspecting the thick cream-colored paper, embossed with the same insignia that had always adorned the Vincent family's most important documents. The raised seal, deeply familiar, yet now foreign in its significance, was a warning. With slow precision, she slid the paper open, lifting the flap and drawing out the contents inside. Her fingers brushed against the edges of the document, the sharpness of the creases marking the importance of what she was holding. The family trust summary. Margaret's final revision, the culmination of years of careful management. Allison had never seen one of these before. Her eyes skimmed over the first few lines, the dense legal language blurring into the background, but then something stopped her cold. The name at the top of the page. Brian. But it wasn't there. Instead, a simple list of names she didn't fully recognize. People from the foundation, attorneys, a few distant relatives. People whose names didn't matter to her, whose involvement had never been part of her mother's conversations. She read it again, slower this time. Brian's name was absent, a void that seemed to echo louder with each passing second. No heir, no successor. No mention of the son who had always assumed he was next. Allison swallowed hard, the realization sinking deep. It wasn't just about who wasn't there. It was about what had been deliberately excluded. Her father, Brian, the legacy that had always seemed so assured, now ripped out with surgical precision. Her heart beat quicker, the finality of it all consuming her thoughts. She thought of her mother, of the way she had moved through the last few months, steadier, sharper, more certain than ever. The quiet power Margaret had always held, buried beneath the years of compliance, was now visible to anyone who cared to see it. "Allison?" Her grandmother's voice broke through her thoughts, and Allison glanced up, startled. Helen stood in the doorway, watching her closely. "Everything all right?" Helen asked, her eyes scanning the letter in Allison's hands, the corner of her mouth twitching as if unsure whether to push for more or leave the question hanging in the air. Allison folded the document slowly, carefully, as though the physical act would somehow preserve the sharp, jagged edges of the truth she was struggling to process. She met her grandmother's gaze for a moment, searching for something in the lines of Helen's face. There was no surprise there, only the cool, practiced look of someone who had already known. "Yeah," Allison said quietly, standing up to place the envelope back in its box. "Just surprised, I guess." Helen nodded, but there was something calculating in the tilt of her head, a brief flash of something that Allison couldn't quite place. "It's all in good hands," Helen said softly, as if trying out the words to see how they felt. A flicker of recognition passed through Allison's chest at the echo of Margaret's own words. She swallowed again, feeling the weight of the moment like a burden settling on her. But she didn't say anything, didn't ask any more questions. She just nodded, as if the silence could speak for her. That evening, the Vincent family gathered for dinner, an event that had once been an occasion for light conversation and familial connection, but tonight felt different, heavy, strained in a way Allison couldn't ignore. The clink of glasses and the hum of voices in the background seemed to lose their warmth as her eyes flickered around the table, settling finally on her father. Brian was seated at the head of the table, as always, but there was something in the way he spoke that seemed louder tonight. Perhaps it was the way he exaggerated the figures, how his voice raised a little too high as he boasted about his latest investment. His words were slick with the sheen of accomplishment, but to Allison, they rang hollow. "I'm telling you," Brian said, looking around the table with a broad grin, "this investment is going to change everything. A real game changer. I'm about to secure a deal that's going to set us up for the next 20 years. Margaret sat at the opposite end, her face as composed as ever, eyes steady, lips quirked into the smallest of smiles. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Allison felt the strange unease tighten in her chest as her father continued, not noticing the way the room felt colder, the air more distant. Elena sat next to him, nodding along, though her gaze flickered toward her mother, her unease palpable beneath her carefully crafted facade. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible change, but it was there. The sense that everything, the whole house, the family, was shifting beneath their feet. Allison knew it wasn't just the money Brian bragged about. It wasn't just the way the conversation had gone from casual to overbearing. It was the feeling that something monumental had just happened in the background, and none of them could quite figure out how to react. Brian paused, finally noticing the shift in the room as Margaret continued to smile without comment, as Elena's polite nods turned stiff. His eyes narrowed, but only briefly, just long enough for Allison to catch the flicker of doubt that crept in. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but the confidence, the certainty in his voice, had been replaced by something more fragile, something that made the air hang heavy. "So, anyway," Brian continued, his tone slipping, "we're going to have a lot more room to work with. I can't wait to see what happens next." No one responded at first. The table, for a brief moment, held its breath. Margaret's eyes were still fixed on him, but there was a coolness in her gaze now that had not been there before, a distance that only widened as the seconds ticked by. Allison picked at her food, not hungry, not interested in what Brian had to say. Her mind was elsewhere, back in the study, with the trust documents, with her grandmother's strained expression. The finality of what she had read was beginning to take root. Margaret had won, and Brian had not even seen it coming. Margaret's smile deepened, but it wasn't one of satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who had accepted their fate. And now, their legacy. And for the first time, Allison understood exactly what her mother meant when she said it wasn't about the presentation. It was about dignity, and who, in the end, would truly preserve it. The Vincent family's annual holiday event was an institution, a carefully curated spectacle where traditions were upheld with the precision of a fine-tuned machine. Every detail had been rehearsed, every person placed exactly where they should be. Margaret had always sat at the head of the table, the matriarch, the one whose opinion was sought on every matter. But tonight, things were different. The place cards were neatly arranged, the names written in gold script, each one a small proclamation of who belonged, who had earned their place at the table. Margaret's place card, when she finally located it, was at the far end of the table, far from the familiar warmth of the head of the table, where her seat had always been. Her name was written delicately, but the subtle shift was impossible to ignore. It was as if the table itself had grown too small for her. As if the family's expectations of her had contracted, leaving her on the periphery. The table was already buzzing with conversation as she approached. Brian sat at the center, his posture straight, a glass of wine in hand, exuding the air of authority he so desperately clung to. Elena was playing hostess, moving with that practiced elegance, her smile perfect, her voice the very picture of graciousness as she flitted from guest to guest. Beside Brian sat Helen, as always, a quiet presence with eyes that saw everything, but the dynamics had shifted. Margaret felt it in the way Brian barely acknowledged her as she approached her seat, the way Elena's polite greeting carried the weight of something more, a strained civility. "Try to keep the stories short, Mom," Brian said with a smile that barely touched his eyes, his voice a little too loud, a little too clipped, as if to remind her of her place in the family narrative. Margaret did not respond immediately. She simply nodded, her fingers grazing the edge of her napkin as she settled into the seat. She didn't need to dignify his words with a reply. She wasn't there to please him, not anymore. As dinner progressed, the clink of silverware and soft murmur of conversation filled the room. Margaret ate her meal slowly, deliberately, but her mind was elsewhere, watching, calculating, listening. The way Brian leaned forward slightly when speaking, the way Elena's eyes shifted nervously whenever someone mentioned the house, every gesture, every shift in tone was now an open book to her. There was no warmth here, there was only a performance. A carefully constructed tableau where everyone had their assigned roles. Helen, who had barely spoken since the meal began, lifted her glass, and the room fell quiet. She was about to offer one of her toasts, the kind that always seemed to center around her daughter-in-law, Elena, and the graceful inheritance she had brought to the family. Margaret watched as Helen's eyes flickered to her for a fraction of a second, the acknowledgement there, but fleeting. Then Helen's voice rang out, steady, practiced. "To Elena," she said, her words smooth, yet somehow cold. "For her graceful inheritance of this home, may it continue to stand strong under her stewardship." The words hung in the air like a thin veil, delicate but heavy with meaning. Elena's smile widened at the compliment, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed something else. Perhaps guilt, perhaps unease. She raised her glass with a practiced elegance, and the room followed suit, toasting to a future that felt more like a memory than a promise. Margaret didn't raise her glass. She didn't offer a toast. She simply watched, her gaze unwavering, the coolness of her silence the sharpest thing in the room. Every word, every gesture, every slight, real or imagined, settled around her like a layer of dust. It was all there, in the cracks of the surface, in the strained civility, in the quiet power that no one seemed to acknowledge except her. As dessert was brought to the table, a plate of delicate pastries and rich cream, Margaret stood. No one noticed her at first, or perhaps no one dared. but as she moved toward the door, her chair scraping softly against the floor, Brian's voice rose, a bit too sharply. "Where are you going, Mom?" Margaret turned, her expression unreadable. "I've had enough," she said softly, her voice carrying across the table, the words hanging heavy, as if they were the final pieces of a puzzle that no one had quite managed to solve. She didn't look at anyone as she spoke, just continued to walk toward the door, the echo of her footsteps the only sound filling the space. Brian's eyes narrowed, his lips twitching with a mixture of frustration and confusion. "You can't just leave. I've already stayed longer than necessary," she interrupted quietly, not even bothering to glance back at him. Her words, calm and unyielding, were a quiet defiance against the expectations, against the roles they had tried to force upon her. Margaret didn't need to stay. She didn't need to prove anything. The door clicked softly as it closed behind her. The noise of the dinner party, the hum of voices felt distant now. Inside, the room held its breath. Margaret stood outside, the cool air of the night wrapping around her like a cloak. She hadn't needed to say much, hadn't needed to make a scene. The silence spoke volumes, and somewhere, deep inside, she knew. The tables had finally turned. The low hum of the office air conditioner was the only sound in the room as Margaret sat across from Elliot Blake. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished desk where the documents lay waiting. The weight of the decision, the finality of what she was about to do, seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Elliot flipped through the papers in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had always been meticulous, but today there was something more in his eyes. Something almost imperceptible. Perhaps respect. Perhaps something closer to admiration. He knew how carefully Margaret had built everything, how long she had played the role of the dutiful mother, the invisible matriarch. But today, she was breaking those bonds. Today, she was seizing control of her legacy. Margaret's fingers hovered over the pen in front of her. She could hear the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, each second passing as if it held all the weight of the years that had come before. She cleared her throat and finally spoke. "Remove both Brian and Elena from the deed transfer. I don't want them on it." Elliot didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, a small flicker of acknowledgement passing through his eyes. "Done," he said, writing a note in the margins of the file. "But who will you name instead?" Margaret's gaze never left the papers in front of her. The answer was already clear. "The Conservatory Foundation," she said, her voice steady. "They will be the beneficiary." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had ever wanted. A legacy built not on familial expectations or corporate success, but on something more meaningful, something that could withstand time and indifference. Her home, the place she had poured so much of herself into, would become something that lasted, something that could never be taken away, even if the rest of the family refused to understand it. Elliot scribbled the new details on the page, his pen moving quickly now. "Your home will become an arts center. Your name will stay on the door. The legacy will carry on, but in a way, you've always wanted. Outside the family, independent." Margaret's lips curved just slightly, her eyes softening for the first time that morning. "That's the legacy I can live with," she murmured, the truth of it settling in her bones. Her gaze flicked up to meet Elliot's, and for the first time, she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done what was right. Not for anyone else, but for herself. Elliot met her gaze, nodding. "It's all in motion, Margaret. There's no going back now." Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. She had made the decision. She had taken control of her own future, and for once, it didn't matter who disagreed with her. As Elliot gathered the papers, preparing them for the final signing, Margaret's mind drifted. She thought of the house that had held so much of her life, her hopes, her dreams, and now would hold something greater: art, creativity, the preservation of what mattered most to her. The door to the house opened with a quiet creak, and Allison's voice echoed through the hall. "Grandma?" Margaret smiled faintly, turning toward the sound. Allison entered the room, her school bag slung over one shoulder, her face tired but bright, with that youthful energy Margaret had always adored. "Allison, sweetheart, how was school?" Margaret asked, her voice softer than it had been earlier. "It was all right," Allison replied, her eyes flicking to the papers on the desk before returning to her grandmother's face. "I was wondering if I could borrow some of your paints for an art project?" Margaret nodded. "Of course. You can have whatever you need." But Allison wasn't looking at the paints. She was looking at the papers, the same trust documents that had been on the desk all morning. Her eyes narrowed just a little, studying the way they were arranged. Finally, she spoke. "They treat you small, Grandma," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "Like you don't matter. Like you're just supposed to step aside and let them do what they want." Margaret blinked, surprised by the intensity of Allison's words. She could see the truth in them. Allison had always been the quiet observer, the one who noticed the things others didn't. And in that moment, Margaret realized just how much her granddaughter had been watching, how much she understood. Margaret leaned forward, her expression firming. "Not anymore, Allison. Not anymore." Allison stood silent for a moment, her eyes searching Margaret's face for meaning. Then, slowly, she nodded, a small but understanding smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The silence that followed was comfortable, full of understanding. Margaret knew that Allison was beginning to see her, to see the woman she had become, not just the mother, not just the grandmother, but a person who had fought for her own place in the world. As they both moved to gather the paints for Allison's project, the weight of the changes Margaret had made seemed to settle into the air around them. Quiet, inevitable, but undeniable. The future was now in motion. The house would be more than just a place for the family to gather. It would be a testament to what Margaret had built, to what she had made for herself. And as she watched Allison prepare to leave, her heart swelled with a quiet pride. This was the beginning of something new. The conference room was quiet when Margaret entered, the soft click of her heels on the polished floor the only sound as she crossed to the large table. The room was immaculate. White walls, sleek furniture, the kind of space that only existed to house decisions of great consequence. Margaret had arrived early, as she always did, well ahead of the others. She took her seat at the head of the table, the one that would soon feel like an echo of her past. Across from her sat Helen, her face calm, her hands folded neatly on the table. Elliot stood by the window, reviewing the final documents, his demeanor focused but professional. Margaret looked down at the papers in front of her. The signature lines were already there, waiting for the moment that would alter everything. She felt no fear now, only a quiet resolve. This was the final step. Her legacy, her decisions, her future. They were all about to be cemented in ink. The door opened, and Brian and Elena walked in, both of them slightly late, as always. Brian's brow furrowed as his eyes swept the room. His gaze paused when he saw Helen sitting beside Margaret. His stride faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he continued toward the opposite end of the table where he usually sat. Elena followed him, her heels clicking sharply as she took her place beside him, her expression unreadable. Margaret watched them both as they settled into their chairs, but her gaze lingered on Brian. His eyes, too, were trained on Helen now. He glanced from her to Margaret, a flicker of confusion passing between them. Elliot, who had been quietly reviewing the documents, turned and slid them toward the center of the table. The papers were positioned carefully, like a chessboard awaiting its next move. Margaret's legal advisors are present, Elliot said, his voice low but carrying the weight of formality. He gestured toward Helen with a slight nod. Brian blinked. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on longer than he expected, his lips pressing together in a tight line. He turned toward Margaret. "She's your what now?" he asked, his voice clipped, the question slipping out before he could even stop it. Helen didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a quiet calm, her lips parting only to speak the simple words, "Trusted party." Her tone was measured, her eyes steady. For a moment, Brian's eyes narrowed, a look of disbelief flickering in his expression. Elena shifted in her seat, her lips thinning slightly as she processed the new dynamic. She glanced at Brian, her face a mask of politeness, but there was something there, an unspoken tension, a tightening in her posture that betrayed the unease she couldn't quite suppress. Margaret sat back, watching the scene unfold with a small, almost imperceptible smile. There was no need to speak. The room had already been set in motion. The silence was louder than any words she could offer. Brian finally broke the stillness. "Wait, what exactly does that mean? She's your what?" His voice was rising now, the disbelief turning into irritation. "This is my inheritance, my future, and you." He turned to look at Helen again, his expression contorting with confusion and frustration. "You're a trusted party?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "How did this even happen?" Margaret remained still, her gaze unwavering, never breaking. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The power was no longer with him. She could feel the tension mounting in Brian's voice, the indignation building with each word. He was trying to regain control, but the reality of what had happened was too far beyond him now. Helen, for her part, didn't react. She simply watched him with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, her hands still and poised on the table. There was nothing more to say, at least not from her. She had made her decision. Elena's eyes flickered to Margaret, and then quickly away. Her expression shifted, her lips pressing together tightly, her gaze betraying an unease that wasn't entirely visible to Brian but was clear to Margaret. It was as if Elena realized in that moment that things were no longer the way they used to be. There was no longer an unspoken pact between them. No more unspoken loyalty to the family's old ways. Allison, sitting in the corner unnoticed, hid a small, knowing smirk behind her hand. She had been watching it all, listening, absorbing, understanding. Her grandmother had always been underestimated, but not anymore. Brian's voice rose again, straining now, his face reddening with frustration. "This is ridiculous. I've been running everything. This is my right. I'm the heir. The one who has always been." Margaret's eyes were the only thing that didn't move. She hadn't even flinched at his outburst. She simply turned her gaze from him to the papers, then back again, letting him stew in the silence for a few moments longer. Her voice was steady, unwavering, like a calm current that cut through the noise. "I'm replacing a pattern, Brian. Not you." The words landed like stones in the water. Brian's jaw tightened as if the truth stung more than he had ever anticipated. Elena's eyes darted between him and Margaret, but she said nothing. It was as though the air in the room had thickened, pressing against them all. Brian's mouth opened, but no words came. The realization hit him a little too late. The silence that followed his outburst felt like a final verdict. He hadn't known how far Margaret would go, or how far he had already pushed her. Margaret looked down at the papers again, the signature line still waiting for its mark. The moment was slipping away from him, but it was already too late. The legacy was hers. And no one, certainly not Brian, and not Elena, could undo what had been set in motion. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of paper as the documents were shifted across the table. Brian's eyes were fixed on the papers before him, but his gaze seemed unfocused, distant, as though trying to grasp something that was just out of reach. His breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling with the effort to control himself. Margaret remained still, her expression unchanged. Her hands, steady as ever, rested calmly on the table. Her calmness was an anchor in the storm that seemed to be swirling around them. She didn't need to raise her voice or make a scene. She had already won. Helen, sitting beside her, took the pen from Elliot's hand and signed her line, the motion crisp and final. There was no hesitation, no drama, just the deliberate act of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The ink dried and a piece of the future was locked into place. Brian stared at the papers as if willing them to change. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came. His face flushed with a mix of disbelief and growing anger. The finality of what had just occurred seemed to freeze him in place. Elliot glanced at Margaret, then at Brian, his voice low and measured. "Any objections?" he asked, his tone almost academic, as if this was a routine matter. But the weight of the question was undeniable. There was nothing left to say now. Brian tried to gather himself, tried to push past the shock and confusion that clouded his thoughts. "You're replacing your own son?" he finally managed to say, his voice tight, the words laced with a mixture of pain and accusation. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't flounder. She met his gaze with unwavering clarity, her eyes steady, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm replacing a pattern, Brian, not you." Her words hit him like a slap. It was a truth he had been avoiding, a truth he hadn't been ready to hear. The pattern, the unspoken rule that had always placed him at the center of everything, was gone. It had always been his birthright, his place in the family, his future. But now, the rules had changed. For a long moment, Brian said nothing. He couldn't. He stared at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to comprehend the magnitude of the shift. He had always thought he had control. He had always believed that his role in this family, in this life, was set in stone. But now, he was left with nothing but the quiet, implacable truth that he had been replaced. In the silence, Allison shifted in her chair. Her gaze was fixed on the table, but her hand slowly, almost imperceptibly, reached out from under the table and found Margaret's. The contact was light, but it was enough. Allison's fingers curled gently around her grandmother's, an unspoken gesture of solidarity, of understanding. Margaret felt the warmth of her granddaughter's touch, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to look down at their joined hands. It was a quiet, tender moment, and yet it spoke volumes. It was a reminder that while the world around her had changed, there was still something that could endure. Something that would always remain. Helen glanced at the two of them, her expression softening for just a moment. She didn't speak. There was no need to. The weight of the moment was too heavy for words. Brian finally pulled his gaze from the papers, looking instead at the faces around him. He searched them for something. Some shred of the respect, the obedience he had once taken for granted. But he found none. There was only the quiet strength of a family that had moved on without him. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came. He was powerless in the face of what had been set in motion. His hands, clenched on the table, shook slightly. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken things. Margaret's eyes flickered to the papers once more, and without a single word more, she took the pen in her hand and signed her name on the final line. It was done. Her legacy was sealed. As she set the pen down, she looked up, meeting Brian's gaze one last time. His expression was a mix of frustration and helplessness, but Margaret felt no sympathy. He had had his chance to change, to grow, but instead, he had clung to the same old patterns, and now it was too late. Brian's voice broke through the silence again, but this time it was quieter, tinged with something close to resignation. "You really did this, didn't you?" Margaret's gaze softened, just slightly, but her voice was firm. "I did. And I'm not sorry." There was a finality to her words, something that left no room for argument, no possibility of return. Brian had been replaced, not by a stranger, not by an outsider, but by a woman who had finally found her voice, her power. And now, the family would have to live with that. Brian didn't speak again. He simply sat there, stunned, his hands clenched on the table. Elena remained silent as well, her eyes fixed on the scene before her, her lips pressed tight. She knew, just as Brian did, that things would never be the same. And as Margaret stood, the weight of the moment sinking in, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The peace of knowing that, at last, she had made her choice. She had taken back what was hers. The first board meeting of the Vincent Initiative was held in a room that was both familiar and unfamiliar to Margaret. The conference table was the same one where family decisions had been made for years, where Brian had once presided, where Elena had once fawned over the details of their social life. But today, the table had been repurposed. No longer was it a symbol of her submission, it was a space for something new. For her. Margaret sat at the head of the table, not with the weight of expectation, but with the weight of authority. She wasn't waiting for permission, she had taken it. The foundation, born of her vision, was now officially launched, and she would shape it however she saw fit. Around her sat the new board members, people she had carefully selected for their expertise and their integrity. People who understood the value of true creativity and social change. But there was one face that was more familiar than the others: Helen, sitting beside her, poised and composed, wearing the air of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. Margaret had made it clear that Helen would serve as the board chair, but that did not mean Helen would have free rein. No, Margaret had built this foundation with the idea of herself at the center. She wasn't going to be overshadowed again. Not now. Not ever. "You've done well, Margaret," Elliot said as he handed her the initial reports. The foundation had already received immediate funding, a direct result of Margaret's estate allocation. There were grants ready to be dispersed to women re-entering the arts, her legacy now cemented in something that felt truly hers. Margaret felt the weight of Elliot's words, and the satisfaction of it settled into her bones like the calm after a storm. She'd protected her legacy from every angle. She had ensured that it would be impossible to challenge, even by the people closest to her. There was no room for maneuvering now. The foundation was hers, untouchable, unmovable. "You've protected it from challenge," Elliot continued, his voice low but with a note of admiration. "Even from family." Margaret's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I had to," she said softly, "to make sure it lasts." The Foundation's mission, to support women in the arts, felt more profound than any family heirloom or corporate position. This was something that would live on far past her own life. This was the kind of legacy she had always wanted. A legacy not measured in houses, investments, or familial bloodlines, but in the contributions made to the world. Helen shifted beside her, hands folded neatly on the table. "You're right, but we're all going to have to make sure this remains focused," she said, her voice just slightly more clipped than usual. It was clear to Margaret that Helen was still unsure of how much space she had been given in this arrangement, but Margaret had already made it clear. Helen would serve as board chair, but only if she didn't try to take over. She wasn't going to be anyone's second fiddle. "Only if you don't interrupt me, Helen," Margaret said, her tone firm but not unkind. Helen's expression softened, a subtle acknowledgement that Margaret had drawn the line. She would serve, but on Margaret's terms. The door to the room opened, and a young woman walked in, her face bright but nervous. She was the first recipient of the Foundation Scholarship, a teen pianist from a small town who had impressed the board with her talent and determination. Her eyes were wide with excitement, and she held a letter in her hand, trembling just slightly. Margaret's eyes softened as she gestured for the young woman to come forward. "Congratulations," Margaret said, her voice warm for the first time all day. "This is your moment." The girl looked at Margaret with awe, the weight of the scholarship settling on her like a mantle. For a brief moment, Margaret could see herself in the girl's wide eyes, the same determination, the same hunger for something more. "I've been waiting for this," the girl said softly. "For someone to believe in me." "I believe in you," Margaret replied, her voice steady but filled with quiet pride. "This is just the beginning." The girl's smile bloomed, shy but sincere. As she turned to leave, she clutched the letter to her chest, and Margaret watched her go, her heart swelling. This was why she had done it. This was the legacy she would leave behind. The room went silent as Margaret sat back in her chair, her eyes flickering toward the papers once more. The first scholarship had been awarded. The first step had been taken. Elliot looked at her, his expression one of quiet approval. "It's done, Margaret. This foundation will stand long after all of us are gone." Margaret's gaze lifted from the papers to her family, sitting around her in that familiar room. And for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She didn't feel like the invisible matriarch of a family she could never belong to. She felt, for the first time in years, that she had finally found her place. Her home, her beloved house, was no longer a place of control for anyone else. It would become the Foundation's headquarters, a space for creativity, for those who truly mattered. No more pretending. No more fitting herself into a mold that never suited her. Her eyes met Helen's across the table, and for just a moment, Margaret allowed herself a smile, small, but real. "It's a new world now, Helen," Margaret said quietly. And this time, there was no one to challenge her. The family, the legacy, the house, everything was in its rightful place. And no one, not Brian, not Elena, could ever change that again. Brian was late. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. He pushed open the door to the grand hall, his eyes scanning the room, expecting the familiar scene, the polite faces of acquaintances, the whispered pleasantries. But today, there was something different in the air. A subtle shift he couldn't quite place. His steps faltered for a moment as he surveyed the long table, the kind of setup that once made him feel like the center of attention, until now. The guests were already settled, most of them chatting softly, drinks in hand, in the private gathering that had become an annual tradition for the Vincent family. But Brian's eyes quickly caught the absence of the one thing he expected: his place card. The name, Brian Vincent, was missing from the table. The seats were arranged, but the spot that had once been his was empty. He stared for a beat too long, his chest tightening as his gaze shifted to Helen, who was sitting toward the middle of the table, a serene smile on her face. "Brian," she greeted him coolly, her voice polite but distant. "I'm glad you could make it." She didn't rise from her seat. Brian's fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe. There was no acknowledgement of his late arrival, no warmth. He had become irrelevant in this place, the one room he thought was his. His eyes flickered to the empty space beside Margaret. There was no seat for him at the head of the table anymore. No one had bothered to place his name where it should have been. Margaret's eyes met his across the room, her gaze unwavering. There was no invitation to join, no subtle motion of deference. She wasn't even looking at him like a son. She was looking at him like a figure she no longer needed to accommodate. Brian took a slow breath, swallowing the bitter knot that formed in his throat, and made his way to the other side of the table. It wasn't the seat he was used to, but it was a seat nonetheless. He moved past it quickly. his face flushed with the sting of being overlooked. As he took his seat, he noticed the quiet presence beside Margaret. Allison, her face turned down as she read from a small journal, her eyes darting over the pages. For a fleeting moment he felt a flash of irritation. She, of all people, had taken the place of his rightful position. He glanced toward Helen, who gave him a polite nod, but her lips were pressed tight. She wasn't the one to turn to. Not today. Margaret spoke first, her voice cutting through the silence that had settled over the room. It was soft but firm, a quiet assurance that everyone around the table had long learned to listen to. "I've always believed that grace can be inherited," Margaret began, her voice calm but carrying a weight of finality, "but only if it is earned." Brian's gaze hardened, but he remained silent. His fists clenched under the table, the words of challenge bubbling up in his throat. But he held back. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a scene. Not yet. Margaret let the words settle before continuing, her gaze steady. "But you can't inherit grace. You choose it." There was a pause in the room, a deep exhalation of breath as those gathered considered her words. The room was full of people who had long understood Margaret's calm strength, but now it felt as though it was different. Deeper, more profound. She wasn't just speaking to them. She was speaking through them. Allison, still with her nose in the journal, shifted slightly, catching Margaret's glance. She smiled, a quiet knowing between them. The gesture spoke volumes. Allison had understood the transition, the subtle change in power. No more pretenses. No more roles they were expected to play. Helen, still in her seat, offered a quiet applause, and soon the rest of the guests followed suit, clapping softly, but with reverence. Brian remained unmoved. The applause felt more like a quiet acknowledgement of Margaret's victory than a celebration of anything truly new. His heart hammered in his chest, but his outward appearance was stone. Impenetrable, for now. Margaret nodded once, acknowledging their respect. But her eyes never wavered from the front of the room. The attention was no longer on Brian. It never would be again. Brian's fingers twitched on the table, and he stood abruptly, pushing back his chair so hard that it scraped noisily against the floor. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes, however, followed the line of the table, from Margaret's poised figure to Allison's composed face. He knew. He finally understood what he had refused to see for so long. He wasn't the heir. He wasn't the center. Not anymore. Without another word, Brian turned and walked out of the room. His movements were sharp, precise. But inside, his world was breaking apart. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind a strange silence, a silence that felt like freedom for some, and like an inevitable loss for others. Elena didn't show. She didn't bother to make an appearance. There was no real apology in her absence, only a stark reminder of what had transpired. She had long since chosen sides. Margaret's gaze remained on the door long after it had closed. She wasn't bothered. She didn't need to explain herself. Everything she had worked for was now firmly in place. The family, her legacy, was no longer tethered to the expectations Brian had always carried. It was hers, and hers alone. The sound of clinking silverware broke the silence as dinner continued, and Margaret allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. There was nothing left to prove. The room no longer belonged to him. It never would again. It was a year to the day since Margaret's quiet revolution had begun. A year since she'd made the decision that had severed the old ties, redefined her place in the family, and set the course for everything that followed. The first anniversary of the Vincent Initiative was now upon them, and with it came the public unveiling of the Foundation's work. The press release was concise, almost understated in its announcement. Matriarch replaces son with trusted ally. The headline read, "A quiet summary of a seismic shift in the family's internal dynamics." The media had picked it up with a modest ripple, their words often laced with a mix of fascination and judgment. The old narratives about legacy, power, and inheritance had been reshaped. But for Margaret, it wasn't about the attention. It never had been. She stood at the front of the room, her posture impeccable, her gaze steady as she watched the art exhibit open in her home. Her former home, now transformed into a space for others. The first pieces were on display, vibrant canvases, sculptures, photographs, all by young artists whose works were displayed for the first time. This was what she had worked toward, what she had always intended to leave behind, a space for creation, not consumption. Allison, now named the advisory youth liaison to the foundation, was there as well, helping facilitate conversations between the artists and attendees. The transformation of the house felt right, like a new skin that had finally shed the old weight of expectation. There were open mic nights, community salons, and gallery viewings in every room, each one a testament to a vision Margaret had always carried, even when she hadn't known how to make it real. "You've done something extraordinary, Margaret," Helen said, as they stood together by the gallery doors, her voice softer than it had been in the past, almost reverent. "This place, it's a different kind of legacy." Margaret nodded, her eyes scanning the room as she watched the mingling crowd. It felt like a home again, only this time it wasn't just a place of ownership, but a space for something greater, something communal. She had taken the reins, and the house had become a hub of creativity, not control. "They erased you from their conversations," Helen added, her words quiet but laden with understanding. She hadn't needed to spell it out. Margaret had felt it too. Brian, Elena, even the old family friends. They no longer spoke of her, no longer sought her approval. The weight of her absence in their discussions was palpable, but it didn't sting as it once might have. In fact, it felt freeing. Margaret smiled, a soft curve to her lips that was free of bitterness. "So I let my name speak in the margins," she said, her voice steady, like the calm at the center of a storm. "I never needed their approval. Not then, not now." Helen watched her, a thoughtful silence passing between them. There was no judgment in her gaze, just the quiet recognition of the power that Margaret had claimed. It was a power Helen had once thought she understood, but now realized was different. Margaret's power wasn't about the obvious, the outward domination. It was about quietly shaping the world in her image, even when no one saw it coming. The first scholarship award ceremony took place later in the evening. It was an intimate gathering, just a few people, the artists, the board members, and of course, Margaret. She watched with a quiet sense of pride as the next recipient, a young writer with a passion for storytelling, stood before the group, accepting her award. This was the legacy that mattered. This was the future Margaret had built, one that had nothing to do with the past, and everything to do with creating something new. As the evening wore on, the art began to feel like a living, breathing thing in the house, each piece a whisper of someone's voice, someone's vision, all housed under the roof that Margaret had once been told wasn't hers to control. In the corner, Allison was deep in conversation with one of the artists, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of a painting as she asked thoughtful questions. Margaret smiled, watching the young woman take her place in the world she had fought so hard to build. This was the legacy Margaret could live with. Not the one where she was just a matriarch in a family hierarchy, but the one where she had created something lasting, a foundation for those who came after her. Helen came up beside her, her expression soft. "You've made a world of difference, Margaret." Margaret nodded, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. This wasn't about the accolades, the recognition, or even the foundation's future success. It was about the shift that had occurred, the quiet power that had moved from one generation to the next, and the understanding that her name, her legacy, wasn't confined to a bloodline. It was in the lives she had touched, in the art that would endure long after she was gone. As the night drew to a close, Margaret looked around the room. There was a quiet sense of satisfaction in her chest. She had made this. She had shaped this. And it was everything she had ever wanted. "You've secured it," Elliot said, walking over to her with a smile. "This is your legacy, Margaret. You've protected it for future generations." Margaret smiled back, the weight of the past lifting with each passing moment. She had done it. The past, the power struggles, the broken family, it was all in the past now. And for the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe. Margaret sat in her study, the soft hum of the house around her a stark contrast to the silence in her hands. Her phone rested on the polished surface of the desk, the notification for a voicemail blinking innocently in the corner of the screen. She hadn't been checking it for the last few days. Too many other things to do, too many responsibilities to shoulder. But today, the quiet of the morning seemed to weigh on her, and she picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth surface before pressing play. The voice that filled the room was familiar, and for a moment, it seemed as though nothing had changed. "Hi, Mom. It's Brian," the voice said, strained and unfamiliar. I think we need to talk. About the house. About everything. I've been thinking a lot lately. And I think we can work something out. You don't have to cut me out. We're family, remember?" Margaret listened to it in its entirety, her face unreadable, her body still as stone. The voice on the other end was a strange blend of desperation and guilt, the kind of tone that someone only uses when they've realized they've pushed too far, but only after the damage had already been done. She could feel the weight of the words in her chest, but only for a fleeting moment. Her thumb hovered over the delete button, and in a single motion, the voicemail was gone, erased as easily as it had appeared. It was done. There was no going back. Not anymore. She didn't feel relief, nor regret. She simply felt nothing. She had listened, and now it was gone. She wasn't going to second-guess her decisions. Later that morning, Margaret hosted a garden brunch for the local grant winners, a small but intimate gathering in the sunlit backyard that had become a sacred space for the community she had created. The air was warm, filled with the scent of freshly bloomed roses and the laughter of the young women who had earned the foundation's support. Margaret moved among them with the grace she had earned, offering words of encouragement to the budding artists, the ones whose futures now stretched before them, bright with possibility. Helen was there too, as always. She was a familiar presence now, no longer the silent observer she once had been, but an active participant. She had embraced her role as the foundation's board chair with quiet efficiency, always a step behind Margaret, never pushing ahead but always there, a steadying force. As the brunch came to a close, Helen raised her glass, her eyes soft with something akin to admiration as she looked across the table at Margaret. "To the woman who raised a son," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd, then raised her standard. The words, though spoken in the context of a toast, felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the journey Margaret had taken, one that had required everything from her, but had also given her everything in return. The applause was warm, but Margaret didn't need it. She simply met Helen's gaze, her lips curling slightly. It wasn't about them anymore, not about Brian or the family she had been expected to serve. Margaret raised her glass, her smile still small, but satisfied. "No second drafts," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of everything she had already built. Later, as the brunch ended and the guests began to filter out, Allison stayed behind, holding a small wrapped package in her hands. Margaret watched her approach, The young woman's face flushed with excitement. "I've been meaning to give this to you," Allison said, her voice soft, but filled with meaning. She handed the package to Margaret, who took it with a curious smile. Unwrapping it slowly, Margaret revealed a simple leather-bound journal. The cover was engraved with the words, "Things I learned, watching you." Margaret felt the air shift around her, the quiet significance of the gift settling into her chest. She looked up at Allison, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. The girl, no longer the quiet observer, was now an active part of the Foundation's future. She was the bridge to the next generation, the very reason Margaret had fought so hard for this new legacy. Allison smiled, her eyes full of sincerity. "I've been watching you, Grandma, and I learned everything I needed to know." Margaret's eyes softened, and for a moment, she was silent. She didn't need to say anything. The words were already there, in the way Allison had stepped into this world with such grace, with such confidence. Margaret had created something enduring, something that didn't need to be forced or controlled. Together, they walked through the garden arm in arm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The gentle hum of life around them was almost peaceful, and Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a blanket. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to prove herself. She had done what she came to do, and now, she could simply watch the world she had built flourish. The path had been long, but it had brought her here, to this moment, to this legacy. She had created a space for those who would carry it forward. She had created her future. And as she walked quietly beside Allison, Margaret knew she had finally found her place in the world. And nothing, not even the past, could take that from her. Margaret turned 73 with no fanfare, no extravagant party or elaborate celebration. For the first time in years, she didn't need the outward displays of affection or recognition that had once been expected of her. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt comforting instead of lonely. She had outlived all the pretenses, outlasted the roles others had tried to assign her. Now, she simply wanted a day of peace, a day to reflect on the life she had built, on her own terms. The only sound in the house that morning was the soft clink of china as Helen set down a fresh batch of croissants on the table. They sat in the kitchen, the warmth of the pastries filling the air with a comforting, familiar scent. Helen was a constant, always by her side, always there for moments like this, when words weren't needed to bridge the gaps. Margaret, however, was the one who had changed. There was no longer any space in her life for obligation, no longer any room for being seen but never truly heard. Today, she had invited only those who would listen, those who had earned the right to sit at her table. Allison joined them shortly after, a quiet smile on her face as she placed a small notebook on the table. "I brought something," she said, her voice soft but filled with meaning. Margaret's gaze lifted from the croissants, and for a moment she saw herself in the young woman, strong, steady, grounded. A reflection of the future she had created. Allison wasn't there to take anything from Margaret. She was there to continue the legacy, to carry it forward with grace. Without a word, Allison opened the notebook and began to play. The notes of a piano piece filled the space, delicate and tender, like a story unfolding. Margaret listened, her heart swelling. This was what it was all about. The quiet, unspoken connection that bound them together. The beauty of a legacy that didn't need to be claimed, but was simply there, unfolding with each new generation. When the music stopped, there was a beat of silence before Margaret's voice broke through. "I wrote a poem once," she said, her tone reflective. "It was in college, long forgotten." She stood and walked over to a small cabinet, retrieving a dust-covered folder. It was old, the pages yellowed with time, but as she opened it, the words were still sharp, still true. She cleared her throat and began to read aloud, the words slow and deliberate, her voice steady but filled with the weight of years. In the quiet, I found my voice, not in the loudest rooms but the smallest spaces, where words had to be earned, where truth was never forced, but quietly spoken. The room hung on her every word, the poetry resonating with a truth she had only fully realized in the last few years of her life. Helen, who had been silent, now broke the stillness with a small, knowing smile. "You've always had a way with words, Margaret, even when you weren't saying them aloud." Margaret smiled back, the corners of her lips lifting slightly. She had spent most of her life hiding behind silences, behind expectations, behind the roles imposed on her. But now, in the quiet of this moment, with the people she trusted most, she felt like her name finally held meaning. Her legacy was not in the grand gestures or the names on a will. It was in the lives she had touched, in the art and the voices that would continue long after her. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Elliot had arrived. He was always punctual, always reliable. He entered with his usual composed manner, but today, there was a soft smile on his face that spoke volumes. "The documents held," he said quietly, standing at the door. "No challenge." Margaret's eyes flickered to him, and for a brief second, there was a subtle acknowledgement between them. The past was finished, the fight had been fought, and the victory, quiet as it was, had been hers. No one, not even Brian, could contest it anymore. "He wouldn't dare," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with certainty. "He already knows what he lost." Elliot nodded, stepping into the room and taking a seat at the table, his presence adding to the calm strength that had settled over them. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as the morning unfolded, each of them sharing in the simplicity of the moment. No grand speeches, no forced smiles, just the unspoken acknowledgement that they had arrived here together. The laughter came next, soft, easy, without a trace of the tension that had once defined this house. They had arrived at a place of peace, of understanding, where each person at the table had earned their seat, not by blood, but by choice. As the day faded, the sunlight spilling through the windows cast long shadows over the table, and Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. This was her table now, one she had fought for, one she had made with her own hands. The family who had once disregarded her, who had pushed her aside, were no longer a part of the narrative she had created. She had built something enduring, something real. And as the evening settled in, Margaret looked around at the faces around her, her smile deepening. For the first time in a long while, she felt whole, not because of the titles, not because of the inheritance, but because of the quiet strength she had claimed as her own. Her final words to herself, to her life, to the legacy she had shaped, were simple but profound. "My son said, 'You embarrass me.' So I let his mother-in-law sit beside the lawyer instead." And in that, Margaret finally found the peace she had been seeking for so long.